Welcome to the Organic Wine Podcast. Hello, this is Adam Huss coming to you from Los Angeles, California. Thanks for listening. The Organic Wine Podcast is brought to you by Centralis. Centralis is my winery, which I founded as an ecological winery, meaning that every decision we make, whether in the winemaking or in the business, is guided by the goal of protecting or benefiting our environment and community. You can learn more at centraliswine.com. That's CENTRALAS wine.com. Please visit to join our wine club or sign up for our email list. My guest for this episode is Greg La Follette. Just when you think you know something about wine, you meet somebody like Greg. Talking with him about wine is like having the sun rise suddenly while you're walking a path at night with only a flashlight. I apologize in advance to anyone who's trying to listen to this while doing something else because you're going to want to take notes. Even if you haven't heard of Greg La Follette, you've probably drunk wines that he helped make. He mentored at BV in the early 90s under Andre Tchelitstcheff. He has designed and redesigned 14 wineries worldwide and was the consulting winemaker for the University of California, Davis's teaching winery. He has consulted for Kendall-Jackson, starting its Crema and Hartford Court brands. He launched Flowers Winery, turning it into a cult brand, featuring its gravity flow green production facility that is still considered state-of-the-art. He went on to manage wine operations at DeLoach and founded Tandem Wines, and has consulted on many other projects too numerous to mention. If you've been following the Organic Wine Podcast at all, it won't come as a surprise to you that with his legendary reputation as a winemaker, Greg gives preeminence to the winemaking that happens in the vineyard before the grapes are even picked. You may have heard the cliche that great wine is made in the vineyard. Well, in this episode, Greg tells us how. He discusses the three most important moments in winemaking that all happen in the vineyard. And, in fact, as I re-listened, I counted at least 2 or 3 additional moments in the vineyard that he discusses as some of the most important moments in winemaking as well. And that's before he even gives a breakdown of the microbial ecological succession during indigenous fermentations and how that lends to more complexity in wine. If you listen closely, you'll find moments throughout what Greg says where he seems to talk about grapevines and people comparatively and even interchangeably. I find something profoundly meaningful in this, as it makes me feel as if Greg has come to know these beings so well that he has achieved a perspective that is not from this modern world, but recalls an ancient perspective from those indigenous groups who also knew their ecosystems with equal intimacy, a perspective of identification and equality with our non-human family, a perspective of compassion and empathy. Even if you aren't working with vineyards or making wine, this episode will give you a glimpse of how much there is to learn about wine, how deep scientific knowledge enables us to listen and serve vines and ecosystems better, and how complex and beautiful our world can be the more we get to know it. But enough intro. As Greg says, the more I learn to shut up and listen. Enjoy. Greg, thank you so much for doing this. First of all, it's truly an honor and a real pleasure to talk to you. And I'm so excited because what little, like I just mentioned, what little I've heard, you just are, in addition to having a huge reputation, you have just a wealth of knowledge to share that I think is really important for people to know about, to learn from you, and to have your mentoring in this form. I think is just really invaluable. So thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thanks for creating this format for us to talk and discuss and tell the stories of wine.
Thank you. And I for those who don't perhaps know your story, could you give us a little, some of the highlights? I mean, there's some things I'd love to ask you about, but if you want to, give us a little bit of how you arrived or just your life story, because it's pretty interesting.
Oh, man. Well, let's see. So I've wanted to be a winemaker since I was 17 years old, but living in LA, it's like, who becomes a winemaker in LA, right? It's kind of like going to rabbinical clown school. No one does it anymore.
Well, I have to stop you right there. I mean, that's what I'm trying to do. And
let me know how I can help you with your journey. I'd love to be of assistance if I can.
Well, thanks.
Yeah, I lived in LA as a teenager, and I basically gave up my idea of being a winemaker for something more practical. I became a professional bagpiper, and I was the ship's piper on the Queen Mary, for instance, and one of two bagpipers in the LA Musicians Union. But
I
that,
love that.
yeah, of course, that ended up not being very practical either, even though it was kind of exciting, to be a young man on the Queen Mary with a kilt. I wore a kilt almost every day in high school because I was the school mascot. It was the Granada Hills Highlanders. So yeah, it was good fun.
That led obviously into, I think, a science career, right?
Oh, very logically, yes, of course. So at any rate, it ended up not being very practical. So after a short stint in the seminary of the Catholic Church, 6 kids later, that didn't take. I kind of did the next easiest thing. I already had a degree in plant biology, and so I became a physical chemist and did HIV research at UC San Francisco right at the beginning of the HIV epidemic. And boy, everybody I worked on died, and I wasn't prepared for that. I was a chemist, and I just really wasn't equipped for, watching all that, the mostly young people die, because back then there
Right.
never was and they happily lived ever after kind of thing.
Right.
So I made a lateral transfer on staff from UC San Francisco to UC Davis, and was on staff at Davis first before I did my postgraduate work on how Burgundian winemaking techniques affect mouthfeel. And I haven't looked back ever since. I had a short academic career. For instance, I'm one of the few Americans who's lectured at the University of Burgundy. Very cheeky for an American to go there and lecture to Burgundians on Burgundian winemaking techniques. But they did ask me. So I went. And I knew there was no way in hell I was going to work on Pinot Noir because I knew where the bodies were buried, right? I knew that it was not called the heartbreak grape for no reason. But everywhere I went around the world, I got kind of pulled, almost kicking and screaming back into the world of Pinot Noir until finally I just kind of I surrendered. I said, Pinot, take me, I'm yours. And since then, I've spent a lot less money on therapy sessions, and things are a lot better now. So now that I've given myself up to Pinot, it's completely it's nice.
You are at one now.
Yes.
Um, that is great. There's so much in that actually, and I actually do really, maybe we'll come back to this at the end because I mean I feel like some of your earlier experience there is, especially at a formative time in your life, must really have directed your perspective on wine and or just your perspective on everything. But
Yeah.
and I think it's relevant now. Like I mean, as we are in sort of global crises, one after another, and local crises, that figuring out how what we do as winemakers fits into these things that seem so much bigger and more important. I think is a
I,
really important question to ask. Like, and I mean, well, I don't know. We're talking about it now, so
yeah.
let's just jump right into that. What? How? I mean,
Yeah.
I imagine you as a young person, this made you ask some really big questions. I know you have the background in seminary, and then you have this you're there at the front lines of the AIDS epidemic in San Francisco. Like, how did wine? How did I mean? I know it's like it doesn't even make sense to switch from wine from those statements, but how did how do you make it fit? Like, how did you make it fit into your worldview and your accounting at that time in your
Well,
life?
I, oh boy, winemaking. I'm not saving anyone's life or anything like that, but I am. I am helping to make people's lives better. I hope by making a delicious product that they can enjoy and celebrate life with friends and family. And to me, that's kind of the best uh, use of my wines. And I'm hopeful that I am doing something good for the world. I'm not, you know, curing cancer or anything like that, but I'm doing something that helps people relax and enjoy life and celebrate life. And that means a lot to me, especially with my own friends and family, to open up a bottle of wine. As you know, as a winemaker, when you pull that cork and open it up and pour it for your friends and family, that's your work that's gone into that.
Mm.
And my cellar, my house burned down last year, but before that, my cellar was filled with all of my life's work. And my kids, even though they grew up working in the vineyard and winery, we didn't have Boy Scouts or that kind of thing. We had you coming to work at the winery after school every day for a couple hours. And
Mm.
so when a couple of years ago, when I had a stroke, my kids would come almost every day and stay for dinner. And even though I couldn't drink wine, they'd go out into the cellar and they'd pull out bottles and look at the label. And it was like turning the pages of the book of life.
Mm.
They would look at a label and say, "Oh, wow, that's the vat that Lex fell into." And then we had this huge food fight. And because I use dairy tanks, so that, if you fall into a tank when you're punching down, all you have to do is stand up and you don't die because you're way above the surface of the fermenter.
Right.
And so they would look at that, and then we'd bring the wine to the table and draw the cork, and everyone would smell the wine, and there would be memories of what that year was like and what that vintage did. And so for me, wine is not just a beverage. It's a story of life. It's a story of who we are and what we've done with our lives and ourselves over many years. And I'm hopeful. I've lost my collection of wines, but I'll just make more, and then I'll leave some for my kids to remember me and other times that they've had with me. That kind of. It's a celebration of life. Wine is really.
Mm. Yeah, that's really beautiful. Um, and I mean, how does it? Well, thank you for that. Well, that was a nice detour. I really appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah.
That's a cool picture too. And I know that you have this reputation as a winemaker, but from what little I've learned, you really are grounded, and started in plant biology and the vineyard. And
Yeah.
I think that's right, correct?
Yeah, exactly. It's a little
And
too hot out there right now, but we've all been, I'm not working right now because I got to keep my finger elevated and stuff. But yeah.
right, right. What our listeners don't yet know is that you just got out of the emergency room for chainsawing your finger while in the vineyard. How can you what happened? How did that?
Well, it was a little chainsaw, and sometimes those can be the most dangerous, an electric chainsaw. And
Mm,
so a tree had fallen down across our fence, and we were getting in our last week. I think I was in Virginia, and actually having dinner with Lucy Morton, who's probably America's #1 ampelographer in the world. Actually, the world, yeah, since Pierre Gallet has passed away. And so I had to come back. We were having deer kind of chewing on our grapevines,
uh,
and I had a little bit of a kickback, and it just kind of ran up my index finger and kind of chewed it up. So, but if it had been an 18-inch gas chainsaw like I normally use, I probably wouldn't have a couple of digits right now. But
wow.
no, wine growing is a contact sport. So I've got 4 fingers now that are kind of crooked or bent or broken or that kind of thing from wine growing.
Right. You said bottling line accidents. There was so many ways that things can go wrong with your fingers.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, so, well, I like to start in the vineyard. Obviously, this is the Organic Wine Podcast, so there's that slant to that is, really just starting there as the foundation for wine. But I know I think it's where you start, and I think what I'd really love to do is get sort of technical about how viticulture translates to wine flavor. Like, how is there just no distinction between wine growing and yeah, like that it's called wine growing for a reason, not grape growing and then winemaking. It's called wine growing.
right.
I've heard you talk about, well, I mean, any initial thoughts about that? What are your
Yeah.
I have some specific questions to ask you, but any thing that you have to say right away.
Well, it's interesting that you would bring that up because just last week I taught, was a speaker at a seminar that was sponsored by UC Davis on how winemaking flavors originate in the vineyard. So,
Ah,
yeah,
well,
I can send you,
fantastic.
yeah, I'll send you my
Uh,
PowerPoint presentation if you'd like.
I would love that. Oh man, I would love that so much. Yeah, and I'll find a way to share it if anybody, if you're willing to let me share that with others as well. I'm sure people would love to know about that.
It
Um,
would be my pleasure.
awesome. I've heard you say something close to the three most important moments in winemaking happen in the vineyard. Can you talk about that? Can you go into that a little bit?
Yeah, you bet. So the three most important moments of winemaking happen before a single berry even makes it across the cellar threshold, and those moments are flowering, berry cell division, and berry cell expansion. And I'm ticking those off even with my heavily bandaged finger right now. It's that kind of fun. Uh, so right now, it's a little too hot in the middle of the day here, but my crew is gonna, which is consists of my wife and Jackson and my associate winemaker and myself. And I've been out of the vineyard all morning, uh, but we'll all get out there again as it cools down. Is flowering is really important because that's what defines cluster architecture, and this is all a part of what's called carbohydrate repartitioning strategy, which it sounds really nerdy and long, and it actually is. But basically, the grapevine has two different modes of things it can do with its carbohydrate resources. It can either do vegetative or reproductive strategy. And vegetative strategy is really important because the grapevine, I mean, your carbohydrate resources go into making cellulose, which are the building blocks of canes and leaves and things like that. And that's basically a 1-to-1 exchange. It takes essentially 1 gram of photosynthate to make a gram of cellulose. And it's really cool because the grapevine can outgrow any opponents, by lengthening itself out. It makes more organelles, leaves that create even more energy for itself. And when it throws a shoot out onto the ground, it can root adventitiously, so it can propagate asexually. And I know a little bit about propagation, having 6 kids, so I just have to kind of
Not asexual, though, I take it.
not asexual, right? So that's what you want to do is you want to get it to start thinking, okay, guys, it's getting a little bit hard to do all this wood, ripening and producing lumber. So let's repartition our carbohydrate resources from vegetative strategy to reproductive strategy. And that's kind of an expensive proposition because, for instance, to make a gram of anthocyanin, that's the color molecules to make nice color or even nice flavors, like what you would smell like linalool, which is a terpene that grapevines make,
Hmm.
to smell really good, like in Riesling and Gewürztraminer and some other muscatty kinds of varietals. That takes 2 grams of photosynthate to make 1 gram of carbohydrate. So
Mm.
why would a grapevine want to do anything so silly as to make more colorful and flavorful berries when it can reproduce already and it can outcompete its opponents and that kind of thing? Well, the answer is that the grapevine at some point says it's a little too tough. We're short on water or nitrogen or whatever it is that they're feeling short on. So let's rechannel our carbohydrate energy into making these colorful and flavorful berries so that we can attract birds to eat our berries and spread our seeds so that we can fulfill that ancient biblical command of being fruitful and multiplying, much as my wife and I've done over the years, and continue on with this form of propagation. And so everything that exists in nature wants to survive. And when an organism is challenged, when it's stressed for survival, like for instance, humans, when we're stressed, when whatever used to try to eat us and we'd run away from whatever would eat us, that stress response is stronger hearts and lungs and muscles, and that's how we would survive. That's our stress response. So to make a world class athlete is not like sitting him on an easy chair and feeding him bonbons, right? So you want to push and stress your athlete, and then allow the athlete to rest and then go again. Grapevine's stress response are more colorful berries rather than our, stronger muscles and hearts. And so we want to kind of be a coach of grapevines and help them to achieve more colorful and flavorful berries. And I mean, it's the same thing. But we could get into yeast, also have stress responses too, and we might into this talk if we get into it far enough.
Yeah, absolutely. So, two questions before we do move forward. You were talking about that partitioning between reproductive and vegetative. The new science. Well, I don't know how new it is, but it's recent for me is learning in terms of soil health about the microbiome down there and how the vines are also using some of those carbohydrates to create exudates to feed that microbiome in the soil. Is that how does that fit into that partitioning as well?
Well, it's very important, and conventional viticulture does not really pay attention to the biomass in the soil, which is unfortunate. A lot of people still make really good wines from conventional farming, but I am a practitioner of organic farming and biodynamic farming, and so for me, the biomass, the rhizomes that move through a vineyard, actually not only help to make the soil and the vines healthier, those particular aspects also help an entire vineyard to communicate with each other. So vines from one end of a vineyard to another actually communicate through their roots and the biomass that exists, and allow, like, if one part of a vineyard is under attack by a pest or a microbe, then it can communicate to the other vines that it's under attack, and so you'd better start making compounds that help you to resist this particular factor, a fungi or an insect or that kind of thing. Uh, Plants communicate with each other, and they do it through their roots and perhaps other ways that we don't even know about yet. And I just feel that that's really important, that an entire vineyard is able to talk with itself rather than using a scorched earth policy.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like you're speaking about herbicides as well as probably tillage or deep tillage or regular tillage anyway.
Yeah, all
Okay.
the above. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, Now, my second question was about when we're sort of you were talking about seed reproduction versus the asexual sort of like what we use when we when we take cuttings and propagate vines by just rooting sticking them in soil and rooting them,
Right.
or when we layer, we create a vineyard by layering a single vine out into the soil.
Hmm.
Wouldn't the isn't there an advantage? And I mean, do you think the vines, I don't know, think is the right word, but is the another evolutionary advantage to reproducing by seed that it's genetically different? So it potentially, if, as we're heading into a climatic shift, this gives their offspring a chance of being a little different and having maybe some new nuances that might give them a better chance of survival than their parent.
Yeah, genetic recombination is one of the foundations, going all the way back to Darwin, about how you can adapt to environment, and so that's a big deal. But we've had the same clones now for hundreds of years because of propagation asexually, and what this means is that the same clone that was there maybe in the 14 or 1500s during that kind of a minor uh, ice age are the same
Yeah.
ones we're having now during this heat spell. And there are definite advantages to not being static and by having genetic recombination and diversity. So, and there's a lot of work being done right now looking exactly at those kinds of recombinations. Andy Walker, who's retiring from UC Davis this year, has devoted his entire career to looking at those kinds of factors.
So, well, we'll get back to your thread. that you were getting into there with stressing the vine to sort of, one of our jobs in managing the vineyard is to create the right kind of stress, like we're training athletes, to get more flavorful, colorful fruit. How do you do that? I mean, what are the techniques that you can point to?
Well, right now, one of the things we're doing in the vineyard today is we are pulling leaves off of from around the cluster. We're just getting started into bloom right now here in the vineyard, and
Okay.
so the grapevine, if you can imagine this on the cane, the grapevine opposite it has a leaf, and right below it has a leaf called the subtending leaf. And while those leaves are expanding and growing, they are carbohydrate importers. They're sucking up carbohydrate. But once they become fully expanded, they become carbohydrate exporters. And it's no accident that right when the cluster is ready to flower, that's when the leaf opposite and subtending the cluster have become fully expanded, and they're now going to put carbohydrate right into that cluster. Well, what if you were to cruelly trick the grapevine and pull those two important leaves right off, right at the point of flowering? And the grapevine goes, oh, wait, where's my payback? And then what happens is the leaves up above have to recruit back down, and the basal leaf below has to recruit up. But you still have a momentary carbohydrate deficiency that occurs. And
Hmm.
what happens is you have less successful flowering. You have what's called shatter. And most growers do not want a lot of shatter. And you can control this to some extent. But you want to have a little bit of shatter, because then what happens is you have fewer berries per cluster, which means more open cluster architecture, which means that when the berries grow, you have more air motion going through the berries and solar penetration. And so that's the most important moment. The next most important moment of winemaking is berry cell division. So if you can continue that momentary carbohydrate deficiency into that point of berry cell division, that means you're going to have less division, fewer cells per berry means smaller berries. And all of us winemakers like smaller berries because you got more skin to juice ratio and stuff like that. And
Uh-huh.
pardon me, the drugs are kind of like making me a little bit loopy right now, which might make this even more fun. But for my fingers,
I'll try to keep you on track, but you're doing great so
okay.
far.
Yeah, and so the next moment after that is berry cell expansion. And if you can limit berry cell expansion, smaller cells means also smaller berries. So that's kind of those three moments
How
what we're trying to look at.
so how the second and third moments, what techniques do you do to do those, to control those moments,
Well,
or
if you
or
pull,
manage them, or
yeah,
push them in the direction for winemaking?
yeah. Well, I used to work. I started a place called Flowers Vineyard and Winery out on the coast, and because it's on the coast, you get plenty of shatter anyway. So you never want to actually pull those leaves right before flowering. You do it actually right after flowering, and
Okay.
so you've already gotten your shatter because it's crappy weather out there in the springtime on the coast.
Right.
But now you've taken away that carbohydrate resource, so that is affecting berry cell division. Now, berry cell expansion occurs all the way through and up until into veraison, so it's a little harder to do that. So, what we used to do out there is you can pull off those leaves opposite and subtending the cluster, but you leave the lateral on, and that lateral that's a little shoot that comes out in the axillary bud opposite of the cluster. Actually, it can happen anywhere on a grapevine, but the lateral opposite of the
Right.
cluster, when that starts growing, all those leaves that are expanding are carbohydrate importers. They're carbo hogs. And so if you're having that lateral sit there rather than taking it off during the berry development, you're actually going to limit berry cell expansion. And
Huh.
the really cool part is in places like at Flowers and at Manchester Ridge. where I also make wine. It is the ridge on the ocean in northern Mendocino County, and at 2,200 feet. It's really extreme. And
Wow.
in a place like that, what you really need during the fourth most important moment of winemaking is veraison. Veraison requires a lot of energy because you're making anthocyanins and flavors and color and also sugar, which is the default.
Right.
But all these other things are uncoupled. It's not the same biochemical pathway. So having a lateral, now that it's fully expanded those leaves during veraison, they're actually going to put energy back the into the cluster right at the point where it really needs to get that veraison going. And so laterals can actually serve as both a quality enhancer by reducing berry size, but then increasing ability of the vine to ripen
At veraison.
grapes. Yeah, and so that's kind of vineyard magic right there. That
Wow. So is it, to get real nitty gritty, do you just want that one lateral opposite the cluster on that first node or leaf, whatever that is? I
well,
don't have the terminology, but
that's the best place for competition. That's for sure.
okay,
Yeah,
great.
yeah.
Do you, I mean, okay, so in addition to that, I've heard somewhere along the line about old leaves versus new leaves. Is that kind of what you're talking about while they're expanding versus they're sucking up carbohydrates versus when they start pushing it back in? Is that what that is talking about? Old leaves versus new leaves, and leaves
Yeah.
like leaving a certain number at the end of the shoot versus ones that are closer to the cluster.
Adam, you are very savvy. I haven't heard too many people talk about old leaves versus new leaves. And to even mention this means that you're way ahead of the game with most people. Old leaves are not as efficient as young leaves are. In fact, they can have just a fraction of, if total efficiency would be 100%, old leaves can be 20, 30, 40%, especially if they're also partly shaded by other leaves as well. And
Right,
in fact,
right.
some leaves can become saprophytic. They're actually they're parasites if they're too shaded.
Oh,
And that's why if you look at a heavily shaded canopy and you reach in, you can pull out yellowing leaves because the grapevine is trying to get rid of those leaves. They're they're respiring. They're not photosynthesizing. So they're doing actually the opposite of what the grapevine really needs. And older leaves just don't do as good of a job as young, new, fresh leaves do, and that's kind of like people too. But the good side about people is that we have a lot of knowledge about what we're doing, and so we can help to regulate ourselves through hormonal control as leaves. So old leaves still provide a really important hormonal control. So, for instance, not producing abscisic acid, with dropping other leaves off. So it's very complex, but even though old leaves aren't as productive, they're still an important part of what's going on with the vine. Like people.
got it. Got it. So if we were going to give a holistic picture of this whole process during the growing season, what would you be looking for on your vine? Like what's a perfect vine look like to you, I guess? Like how do we simplify this to a more visual, looking at the vine and what you want to see in terms of, the length, the number of leaves, light penetration, laterals, anything at all like that. What do you want to see? And I guess that depends on the vineyard as well. So take it however you want to take it.
Yeah. Well, from one region to another, the vines aren't perfect. For instance, in the Central Valley, laterals are not as important. And in fact, they can add to shading. So you may want to take those off, whereas on the coast, laterals are more important. But in general, the perfect grapevine is something that will have 11 to 14 leaves per cluster, will have dappled solar penetration, so a leaf layer number. That's if you take a little a stick and you stick it through the canopy, and the number of leaves that you touch should be less than 2 leaves,
Mm.
and that the shoots stop growing right shortly after you've gotten just enough leaves to ripen your clusters. So if your shoots are still growing into the fall and you have to do hedging, that's not the perfect vine. In fact, it's
Hmm.
easier to say what is not a perfect vine than what is. But uh, a vine that
How
grows out until the shoot tips stop growing right about the time of aeration is perfect.
how do you manage that in the vineyard if you do have a vigorous vine that is one of those that you're seeing tons of production and growth that you need to hedge into late fall?
Yeah. Well, there's a number of things you can do to harness excess vigor. Of course, you don't want to add extra fertilizer. The single biggest contaminant in groundwater in California are nitrates from
Right.
nitrogen fertilizer. In fact, it's estimated that 60% of our groundwater has one form or another of nitrogen pollution in it. So too much fertilizer is not good. Also, not enough fertilizer is not good. When I send you that
Right.
PowerPoint, you'll see that I made that point on that.
Right.
You
And when you say not good, are you referring to in terms of not enough fertilizer? Is that where you get into bad chemistry when you get into the cellar, where you're trying to make wine and you don't have enough yan or things like that?
Exactly. And
Got it.
yan, of course, is yeast available nitrogen for those who wouldn't know that. So one does have to pay attention to that in the vineyard and then again in the winery as well. And I'm not a big proponent of using like diammonium phosphate or other forms of nitrogen to add to a must. I'd like for it to
Right.
try to do its own thing. But if
Right.
you do have really low yeast available nitrogen or yan, you do need to add some nutrient supplements for the yeast. So you can use cover crop to help to reduce vigor, the competition. You can
Yeah.
use devigorating rootstock to help with devigoration. So 420A is a good example of a devigorating rootstock.
Hmm. Okay.
Um, you can look at vine density and planting as another factor. Uh, you can look at early season water deficit, and that's another thing that's on my PowerPoint. Is if you can provide early season water deficit, then you're really going to help with all kinds of quality factors for the vineyard and the winery and the wine.
Oh, so it's important. I mean, I think we're all soon in California heading to early season and late season and mid season water deficit,
Yeah,
unless we're tapping into some aquifer resources. But um, so dry farming sounds like it could be a way to do that, assuming you. But can we talk about watering a little bit in irrigation when to water? Like what are those moments that are important for watering? I mean, generally, I guess, like what does it affect? When does the vine need what? And you know, obviously, there's a whole range of areas that, like you're just saying, like if you have a vigorous vine, you might want early season water deficit. But maybe you don't have a vigorous vine. Maybe the opposite is true. You have old vines that are very low vigor, that kind of thing. What can you talk a little bit about how water is important at in the timing of it?
yeah. The single most important winemaking decision that you can make, winemaking decision, is when to start watering your vineyard. That's hugely important. And if you water too early, you're going to increase your vegetative cycling. And recall that there's the two different modes for the grapevine to use its photosynthate: vegetative or
Yeah,
reproductive strategy. So if you water too early, you're going to extend vegetative strategy, and the grapevine won't want to do things like ripen its tannins because it's still thinking, "Hey, I've got all the water I need. I can still doing this. I can keep making lumber." So you want to get the grapevine to stop thinking about doing wood production and start thinking about reproductive. Uh,
huh.
so um, basically, you want to have essentially full water saturation up to and at about flowering. And then after that is when you want to start projecting water deficit in a grapevine. And for those of you who are listening, that would mean somewhere between 10 to 14 negative bars using a pressure bomb. And for those of you growers out there who are not measuring those things, you probably should either get a pressure bomb or share one with neighbors, that kind of thing, and kind of figure out what is the most important moment for you to start watering based on something like that. Of course, there's lots of other materials and methods to measure grapevine water status, like neutron probes or gypsum blocks, things like that. But my favorite device for measuring grapevine water status is a device called a grapevine and a shovel. And so you need to look for diurnal fluctuation, which means that in the morning, all your vines are very perky. They're looking really upright. They're really like standing up. When you've seen a wilted plant, you know that that's not perky, right? So by the afternoon, if those vines are starting to look cansado, they're starting to kind of droop a little bit. Well, that may or may not be the right time to water, because grapevines tend to outstrip by their evapotranspirative potential. They're throwing out water out of their little apertures, their stomata, their breathing apertures. If in the next morning they're perking up right again, that means that there's plenty of water there. They just couldn't keep up during the day, and then it's regenerated at night. And so it's not the right time to water. And you have to really watch that really closely. You have to spend time in your vineyard. You go out early in the morning and you see how perky your vines are. And then you go out in the afternoon and see how tired they are. And then late in the evening or early in the morning again, you want to look and see whether or not those vines are recovering. And of course, there are rootstocks like that are Riparia based, which is a water-loving rootstock that if you're looking at diurnal fluctuation and you kind of miss that cutoff, then those particular grapevines like 5C or SO4 are going to not perform very well. So it's very tricky. You have to really get to know your vineyard pretty well. And I have a big advantage in living in the vineyard that I work with and watching it every day. I'm actually looking at it right now.
That is great. And me too. I've planted our yard in Los Angeles as a vineyard.
Wow. What kind of varieties do you have in rootstocks? It's pretty cool.
Well, great. So yeah, I planted the front yard vineyard with Syrah on Riparia Glory. We have heavy clay for about 2 feet, like just really heavy clay for about 2 feet, and then I think pretty much under that is just sand. Now I wouldn't have done Riparia Glory if I'd known anything about what I was doing. I because I'm and I was just about to get into this, which is I'm really concerned about planting vineyards at all that have to be irrigated at this point in California's history. Like right. I want to plant things that actually grow where they can grow with what's available without without trying to take resources that might soon become vital just for survival, first of all.
Right.
But just, for the sake of having something that it thrives where it is with the climate that it's in, rather than trying to, give it a bunch of crutches to survive on. Right. So I probably, so to correct for that, I planted the backyard with Narodavila and 1103P. So an Estevelis. I think that's Estevelis, right? Is that
1103? That's Paulson cross. Yeah, right.
Yeah, I think so. It's a little more drought tolerant, or significantly more drought.
Right.
Yeah, significantly more drought tolerant.
180 degrees opposite. Riparia is
right.
Totally not, and then 1103 Paulson is totally drought tolerant. Yeah.
Right. So that's and then I have a few vines that I just kind of scattered about. I have some Sangiovese on like 5BB and some Pinot that's still sort of holding on as a pergola, trained over our pergola on I have no idea what, because it was before I even knew anything about rootstock.
Yeah.
And then we have a bunch of vines from seed as well, and then some own rooted like Syrah and Mission as well.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah, just some fun stuff, just trying to learn and see what does well. But the Syrah, strangely, has made some really incredible wine. And we've been, what I found last year, and this is, maybe an interesting question, was it didn't, like, it got to a point in Veraison where it just wouldn't ripen any further. Like I was checking bricks, like every week, I'd pull a berry here, pull a berry there. And for a month, it just didn't change, or more than a month, like 2 months. I finally picked it in late September because, I was starting to see shriveled berries, but the bricks were still like 23 bricks. It had only gotten to 23 bricks.
Uh-huh.
And yeah, I don't know what was going on. I mean, I had a friend who said, well, maybe it's just because you're not watering. It's like the vines are just sort of shutting down, and weird things are happening because we're basically trying not to irrigate it, and it's riparian. So I don't know. Who knows? But
Well,
any thoughts?
yes, for right.
They're also young vines too. Like this is their fifth leaf.
So, a question: what is the paradigm formation looking like around the time of veraison? Are you getting wood ripening around the time of veraison?
Not really. I mean, these things, grow into December. I'm actually like
Wow.
hedging them, yeah, to be able to like force them into dormancy. I mean, it's, we're in a sort of semi-coastal, Los Angeles center of the basin, so it's, it's almost subtropical in a weird way here.
Uh-huh.
It's moist. It's yeah, and so I joke that we could almost get two crops off the vines. Like
Well, you can in some places like India. They get two crops.
yeah.
Uh, so you're in LA proper. You're not like over the hill over the Santa Monica
Right.
Mountains.
No, it's like
Yeah.
we're just inland enough where we get some good heat. But we also get like an afternoon breeze because we're right down in the basin. We're in South LA, and so there are some like the Baldwin Hills sort of funnel
Uh-huh.
the coastal breeze right across our yard every afternoon,
Sounds
and it
pretty
cools
good.
it down.
Uh,
It's lovely, yeah. So I thought it might be good for
you
vines.
probably should buy some of your neighbors' properties and knock down the houses and plant them with valuable viticultural stuff.
I I've already offered. I was rejected.
Okay. All right.
Uh,
Thanks for that.
we do. Yeah, I've been talking to the city about a vacant lot across the street, but so far no deal. Um,
Oh, well.
and I worry what price tag they might want for it, but
Yeah.
that's yeah.
Right. Well, they've done that in Napa, for instance. They've knocked down houses to get the viticultural ground for valuable grapevines that you can get
Wow,
$40,000 a ton for. Yeah.
that's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'd be happy if people just wanted to convert their lawns into vineyards. We could have a little Crenshaw AVA here. I'd be I'd
Yeah.
be thrilled with that.
And they'd also probably be more water thrifty too, because you'd probably
Yeah.
only need a fraction of the amount of water that a lawn does. So,
Absolutely. That's my sales pitch.
okay. Sign me up for how I can help you to convince your neighbors.
Okay, definitely. You know the guy that started La Crema? He wants you to convert your yard into a vineyard. Um, well, okay. Where were we? I apologize.
We were talking about veraison and how
Right,
that's really carbohydrate intensive as well. And hopefully,
right.
your shoots will have stopped growing. The shoot tips will have stopped growing at veraison. And ironically, once that happens, you can water about as much as you want because now you're not going to regenerate more vegetative growth because your plant has completely cycled over from vegetative to reproductive strategy.
Got
And,
it.
and then you can give your vine all it needs to help finish photosynthesizing and producing all the yummy flavors, which might be an issue with your Syrah as well. So it's possible.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I really everything I do is to try to devigorate it. So we've got big cover crop. I don't irrigate. I give it like when I feel like they're just gonna collapse because it's riparia and we
Yeah,
haven't watered and it's been 100 degrees for 2 months. Then I give it some water. But
right.
beyond that, I mean, we probably water 2 to 4 times a year, and that's about it. Just a deep, heavy thing, and that heavy clay really holds on to it,
Right.
and so that's about it. But yeah, well, what I'm you we were talking a little bit. Well, before I was going to mention yeast, you mentioned yeast, but before we get into the cellar, I'm sure pruning has a lot to do with this as well. Like you're going to need spacing, and you want positions that aren't on top of each other and crowding each other. So
Right.
that is going to help with the light penetration and
Yep.
airflow and everything else as well. So you do you have any preferred, like, what can you talk about your home vineyard there? What are you growing and kind of rootstock, and you're watering and trellising and that kind of thing?
Yeah, I'm using what's called a modified double Guyot system, GUYOT, and
Okay.
um, rather than using straight canes across the fruiting wire, I used an arched cane. And that's because the middle of the cane has what's called cane weakness. You don't get as much growth in that middle, and that's because the grapevine is a climbing animal. And so it has
Mm.
what's called apical dominance. And so the end of your cane that you leave behind for that year is going to have the strongest growth on it. There's two kinds of dominance, actually. There's apical dominance, which is the end of the cane, and source-sink dominance, which is where all the plumbing is around the head of the grapevine. So if you can imagine, for our listeners, the grapevine has a head, which is where it's all pruned down to that one head, and two canes coming out of that head. Every year you cut back to two new canes, not using the ones from before. If you use canes from previous years, that becomes a cordon. And so that's a cordon trained spur pruned, which is not my favorite, but it works really well for some varietals and in some places. But out on the coast where I live, you want to do cane pruning, which is because if you're just doing cordon trained spur pruned, if you're just pruning back to two buds, those two buds that you prune back to have seen the worst and crappiest weather and are going to be less bud fruitful. They're going to have less fruit attached to them. But the cane that you select rather than just two buds, if you take 10 or 12 buds, then all of those buds are going to be more fruitful and you're going to get better fruit quality. And so you arch the cane so that you make the grapevine think, oh, this top part, this middle of the cane that's arched, that's the highest part of the vine. So let's push that stronger. And that, to some extent, beats back mid-cane weakness. And then, yeah, and then the other thing we do, instead of two renewal spurs for the next year, I actually have short canes. They're shorties, and you put those out into the middle of the arch. And so those short canes, the ends of the short canes have apical dominance, and they'll push up into the arch. And so now, instead of in one space, one area, you just have one shoot that's on the arch. You now have two shoots because you got the one that's underneath it. And you can now choose which one of those two shoots is more fertile and stronger. And so you don't need both of those shoots in there. So you have to take away one, but then you'll still have better quality wine because you have a stronger shoot, not a weak shoot. And you're going to ripen your clusters a lot better. So that's the way we're doing it here. And it's more labor intensive and harder to do. You need more skilled people, but it's mostly,
yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah.
That you just described things that I always wondered about. And I always thought, the main advantage was, because I didn't know all of this other stuff that you just described, but I always thought, and maybe you can disabuse me of this idea, but I thought the cane versus the spur pruning would also give you an advantage with like diseases and fungal pressures as well, because you're starting afresh with fresh wood every year as opposed to old wood that will house spores and things.
Quite so. Yes.
Okay, that's also an advantage. Okay, got it.
Mm-hmm.
Nice.
Yeah.
How and you also, I want to give you a little chance to talk about Marshall, for example, but you're working with old vines, and I'm wondering how that fits into your overall approach to wine and winemaking. Why did you choose those? What since we're in the vineyard, can you talk about why you like to work with the old vines?
Well, all the old vines that I work with, I did not seek them out. I didn't choose them. They chose me. And so I really took that as kind of a mission. And of course, I named it after my wife and my business partner's wife, Mara and Michelle. So Marshall, which also in French means a little step up.
Nice.
So, oh boy, old vines are really important to us genetically. And old vines tend to hold a lot of wisdom in their bones, in their roots and trunks, and they know how to regulate themselves. Old vines have seen all of it. They've seen drought and fire and flood and just about everything you could imagine, and they're really good at hormonally regulating themselves. Like a young vine will just kill itself with a lot of vigorous growth and evapotranspiration potential, and it'll just crash and burn. But old vines won't necessarily do that. vines are kind of like people. When you've got a young vine, or let's say you've got a young kid, your little daughter, and she's just 2 or 3 years old, you're not going to put a big backpack on her. You're going to give her a little Hello Kitty backpack and put a sandwich in it, and then go for a hike together. And as your kid gets older, you can actually start, putting a water bottle in there and some other things, and then they get to be teenagers, and you can start loading them up with the full internal frame Kelty backpack and go
Right.
go
The iron
hiking.
skillet.
Yeah, and as people get older, they can do more stuff. But when they're really young, when vines are really young, you have to admire them for their brightness and their joyfulness and liveliness. And so little kids are a marvel because they're just so vivacious. And young vines can be very fruity and vivacious, and you appreciate them for that. But as vines and people get older, they can do more work. And when they're in the prime of their life, they're really doing the heavy lifting. But as vines get older, they decline in productivity. But at the same time, too, they know how to conserve. They know how to regulate themselves. And there's a lot we can learn from old vines and old people about how they conduct themselves and their lives and the wisdom that exists in their bones or their roots. And so I'm a big believer in old vines and old people. And of course, I'm now an old people. So I got a few years ago, World of Pinot anointed me as a pioneer of Pinot. And all that means now is I'm just an old fart. So
Was that when you knew that you were old, when they did that? What
yeah,
was the moment?
yeah, I think that was the moment when I said, damn, I must be getting old. I'm not
But
old
when
yet,
you're
but I'm getting there.
right, right. When you get designated a pioneer of something, you must be getting close to something.
Yeah. Yep.
um, well, okay, so I will bring us back. You mentioned, and we don't have to go in depth into this, but I did want to, you are known as a innovative winemaker, and all of this then translates to the cellar, and I wondered if you wanted to get into that. I know that you have some thoughts about yeast. I think we were talking about stress, and stress in relation to yeast, if I'm correct, and maybe correct me if I'm wrong. But if anything, you want to jump at any point, you want to jump in, and then I'll start asking more questions.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm a believer in wild or uninoculated fermentations,
Hmm.
and there's two big differences between inoculated and uninoculated fermentations. The first is that inoculated fermentations are conducted basically by one organism, whereas wild fermentations are conducted by a whole series of different organisms, successionally speaking. And the second thing is that when you're inoculating, you're adding, 10 to the sixth cells per milliliter, and the carrying capacity of wine is 10 to the eighth cells per milliliter. So you're only asking for about 100 times replication, which is not all that. It sounds like a lot, but it's not all that much, because what if you're starting with 3 cells per milliliter and you're still having to go to 10 to the eighth cells per milliliter? You're asking for millions of replications. That's pretty
Mm.
significant. And that allows for you to have a lot more stress responses from your yeast. So, and that also allows for your organismal succession to proceed in a way that really increases complexity of your wine. So it's kind of like after you have a forest fire, you've got a barren patch of ground, right? And
Right.
some grass seeds might blow in and then germinate, and those are the first seeds that colonize the soil. They create more tilt to the soil and water holding capacity and organic matter. And then a bird flies in to eat the now ripening grass seeds, and while it's there, it deposits a bush seed with its own form of fertilizer, and then that grows up to create even more tilt to the soil and water holding capacity, and more importantly, shade, so that then an acorn falls into that shade. And then after thousands of years, you've got the prime species of your biome, which in our neck of the woods is redwoods. Well, that kind of
Mm.
organismal succession occurs in about a 10-day period of time in a vat of wine, and you can actually see it under the microscope.
Wow.
They're not redwoods, but you have to have a microscope. The very first yeast that colonizes a cold must or juice might be a cryogenic or cold-loving yeast like Clecera. Clecera is a piculate yeast, so it's real easy to see. It's got two pointy little ends. It looks like a very badly hand-rolled cigarette. Having raised 6 kids in West Sonoma County, I know what those look like. So it starts growing up, and it's cold-loving, but its metabolism warms up the must a little bit, and it also creates carbon dioxide gas so that the bad guys, vinegar bacteria, don't get in. And as it dies off at about 2% alcohol, it's prepared the way for the next yeast, which might be something like Pichia. And then Pichia grows up, but as that Clecera, the first yeast, dies out, it produces a compound that can smell of smoked meats or roasted venison, 4-ethylguaiacol. And that, I love getting just a little bit of that smell in my red wines in particular. And so the next yeast, as it grows up, it produces compounds that might smell of, forest floor or mushroom. And each yeast, as it dies out, is producing these compounds that smell and taste really good until you get to Saccharomyces, the finishing yeast, which can produce compounds that smell of rose petals or violets, 4-ethylphenethanol, for reasons that we don't have time to get into now, biochemistry. But trust me that those things exist. And the whole point of being a winemaker is not trying to make wine so that the consumer can say, "Oh, this is 4-ethylphenethanol." You just want to make a wine that the taster says, "Wow, this is really complex and delicious." Our job as winemakers is to understand the language of winemaking, the science or the art. The science of winemaking. It's like my first major in college was music, and when you study music, you study the science or the language of music. You study call and response, timbre, meter, pitch, tone. That's what goes into you, the science or the language. What comes out is the art. So we as winemakers need to understand the language of wine, which is the language of yeast cell biology and vine physiology, so that we can produce wines that the consumer will say, "Wow, this is really flavorful," or this really has great texture.
That's really well said. What a and I am conscious of your time, and want to just ask at this point, what is your vision for your wine? And I mean, how would you describe your approach, or what you want to do with wine at this point?
Well, I think at this point, I would say, what does wine want to do with me? Um, wine
Great
has
question.
wine has led me to making Marchel, which is dedicated to ancient vines, and the wine has led me to speak to the language of the land and help to translate that. Wine has led me to, in a way, my own little bit of immortality because I'm going to be dust in the wind in a few more years, but the language of the land is eternal. It's the rocks and the sun and the wind and the rain. Those things will last forever, and it is an honor and a privilege, and also a great responsibility for me to be a conduit of the voice of the land. And if I don't sit and really listen to what it is that the land wants to say, I may miss that opportunity, because who are we as mortals to offer even one letter to the voice of the land without first listening very carefully to it for long years at a time and really trying to understand what it is trying to say? So we become servants of the land in our jobs as winemakers. And I don't have a vision for the land. The land has a vision for me. And lately it's bringing forward these ancient vines so that they can speak more purely and clearly.
Oh, that's really beautifully said. I wish more people felt that way and thought that way. It seems not the norm. It seems like there's so much human ego and intention in wine, in the mainstream approach to wine. Um, I think that is a lovely, beautiful thing. I wish we could end on that, but I want to end on giving you a chance to talk about your Marshall and anything else that you're doing. If you want to, any way that people can taste what you are making and how you're doing those translations.
Well, the best way to get a hold of Marshall wines, we are not readily available. Most of my wines, I'm only making between 50 and 150 cases of each wine. So
Wow.
there's just not very much of it to go around. So the best way to find my wines is at marchellewines.com. That's MARCHELLE wines.com. And sign up for either our mailing list or wine club, because a lot of the wines that I make are pretty unique. They are very expressive. I use, I've done 68 vintages across 5 continents, and I didn't start when I was like 1 year old, but I've sometimes done 2 or 3 vintages a year, and I've learned a lot. And so my winemaking is very informed by that. And it's very informed by the fact that I don't really know a whole lot. I'm really allowing the wines to tell me what it is that they want and need. And the more I learn, the more I understand that I just really need to shut up and listen to what's going on. And so my wines are all about texture and smoothness. I'm not, I don't have the biggest Pinot in the room when you get a bunch of wines together. But hopefully my wines have grace and not power, but kind of power, but then kind of almost levitating and defying gravity. That's what a good Pinot should be able to do, have both power and be able to levitate. So that's kind of what I'm looking for in my wines. And I want to make wines that my wife and my family love to drink, and my friends, because that's the best use of my wines, is a celebration of the land and the people whom I love. And hopefully people who share that with their loved ones will feel that.
I love that. That sounds, that sounds wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you for asking about, what I'm doing too. I really appreciate that.
Well, as a fellow winemaker, I know you feel many of these things that we discussed. And one of your great joys, I'm sure, is opening a bottle of your wine with your friends and family. That's the highest use of our wines that we make.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's, I mean, my approach sounds very similar to your approach, actually.
Good show.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you, Greg. I really, really appreciate talking to you. And you honestly just were a huge wealth of, I know, helpful information for so many people just by the things that you just said. So thank you.
Well, Adam, thank you for telling the stories of wine. This is something that's a skill that is needed in our industry, and you're doing it.